Two and a Half Admins, episode 213. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Malaysia's plan to block overseas DNS dies after a day.
Yeah, so the telecom regulator in Malaysia had this brilliant plan that because only companies in Malaysia are subject to Malaysian laws, we'll just make all the ISPs in Malaysia route any DNS queries to services in Malaysia. So no more Google DNS, no more Cloudflare, no more external DNS. We'll just block it at the ISP level. Nobody will be able to connect to a DNS server that's not from Malaysia. And that's the only way we can block harmful websites like gambling and pornography and copyright infringement. And we're going to block scams too. We promise. We'll block the scams.
Yeah.
Yes, we heard you say Cloudflare, Alan.
That's some Stallman level punning there.
It was also interesting in their little FAQ about it. They put that, quote, "No, the DNS redirection will not affect your connection speed or browsing experience for legitimate websites." And while DNS is not going to affect your connection speed, the quality and latency of the DNS you have can greatly impact your browsing experience and your overall snappiness, the feel of your connection and your web browser. And that is why so many people are using not their ISP's DNS server, because DNS being a service your ISP is kind of obligated to provide, but doesn't really bring them any value, means they often just phone it in. Whereas a DNS service that's out to be good will give you much better browsing experience. And so who knows what one that's trying to apply a bunch of rules and try to block copyright infringement it's actually going to perform like.
Now, to be fair, it is absolutely technically possible for the Malaysian government to run a DNS service that would not, in fact, slow down browsing or connection in any measurable way to any of its inhabitants, and it could actually improve it. They could very well run a high-performance DNS service that responded quicker than external DNS sources did and improved the connection speeds and browsing, yada, 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 yada. The problem here is that we don't know that. We don't know what they're going to do. We don't know what resources they're going to allocate. And as Alan mentioned, historically, organizations that just sort of get into DNS as a sideline they don't really care about almost never do a tolerable job of it. It's very convenient to say, oh, we won't make your internet go slower. And you can even, like I just did, you can make sound technical arguments that no, you won't slow anybody's internet experience down. However, you do start to have to ask questions about, I don't really know about a government that's trying to get so deep into my business. They're like, I literally can't look up something on the internet if they don't like it, to the point that they're, hijacking and mangling traffic. The specific proposal wasn't even simply to block outbound UDP and TCP port 53 across a firewall. It was to actually hijack and redirect those requests, which standard DNS is not encrypted. It's not even TCP. It's UDP. It's very easy to hijack and redirect to another server that can then respond to you. Now, DNS over HTTPS, that's a different story. That's much more difficult to hijack. And Malaysia would have to literally just plain block that, which also has some interesting follow-on issues there, because now we get into the issue where the government of Malaysia said, no, we won't impact your browsing experience. Well, your first day browsing experience might be very heavily impacted because a lot of modern browsers are shipping by default with DNS over HTTPS to one of their providers, which won't be the government of Malaysia's. So if they implemented this, you could see people who are installing Firefox or Chrome and unable to get anywhere on the internet until they resolve some arcane setting that, well, they can't even look up on the internet because they can't get to the internet.
Do you think that's why they rolled this back after like 24 hours then, rather than the backlash?
No, I think it was mostly a lot of backlash. And, when you're trying to claim it's just to block pornography and scams, and we're going to protect vulnerable people from harmful content on the internet, it's kind of hard to claim that when, like you say, they're just really likely breaking a lot of things.
I think the best answer to your question is the one provided by Malaysia's own communications minister, who told MCMC not to proceed and instead seek comment from industry stakeholders. Not from, folks at home that might be upset about it, industry stakeholders, which sounds to me like, they were worried about the big tech giants, the Googles and the Cloudflares and the what have you coming after the government of Malaysia and frankly being more of a pain in the ass than one small government really wants to take on head to head.
Proposed underwater data center surprises regulators who hadn't heard about it.
Yeah, so this is a tech company in San Francisco announcing that we're almost done building our thing. We're going to sink this ship into the bay of San Francisco and have an underwater data center. And we'll be doing it real soon now. And the regulator's like, you didn't ask for a permit for that. And the company's like, well, we don't need a permit, do we?
You say company, it's very much a startup.
Yes.
Yes, it's a startup who specifically wants to drop a capsule full of, quote, GPU servers, unquote, into the drink. So one can imagine why they would be, really excited about the possibilities of, both the free cooling and, maybe not so much the noise complaints with air cooling as some other GPU servers that we've covered recently, I guess I could say.
No, I don't think this is crypto bullshit. I think this is AI bullshit.
I think you're correct, but ultimately it kind of comes down to the same thing either way. Yeah, I mean, for what we're talking about in terms of potential heat, noise, power consumption, whether it's AI or whether it's crypto, you're still essentially talking about running a bunch of the biggest GPUs you can possibly find, balls to the wall, 24/7, 365. So from a technical standpoint, it doesn't really much matter whether it's AI or whether it's cryptocurrency.
I like how they try to claim that it's like, this will reduce the temperature rise in the ocean caused by all the on-land data centers by just putting them underwater and venting the heat directly into the ocean.
I don't think that's unrealistic, honestly. If they achieve much more thermally efficient cooling by directly putting the data center in the drink, I think it's entirely possible that, yes, they will have less of an overall energy impact on the entire biome, which is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, locally it's going to heat the water up, but if you look from a more global perspective, it is probably a better idea.
Yes.
Well, and I think that's also just a core difference here is when we've looked at this before, like the Microsoft one we talked about that they decided not to renew.
Project Natick.
Yeah. They put it hundreds of miles offshore where they're not going to be able to influence the local water temperature. In this case, they're talking about putting it in a protected bay that, the water doesn't cycle as much and it's a much more critical biome. And so if you raise the temperature even slightly, you're going to screw up all the local wildlife and possibly also it's more than just the temperature. We were talking about the noise when you have data centers on land. Just because it's water cooled doesn't mean it's not going to put vibrations in that are going to, annoy animals, right? When we talked about the Bitcoin mining data center, it was like making the local dogs shed all their fur. Is it not possible that some of the vibrations and things that are putting these things underwater in a protected habitat are not going to cause issues for the wildlife in that habitat as well?
Just to make this clear, when we talk about how much closer to land and how much less circulation and how much easier it is to have an oversized impact, the average depth of the San Francisco Bay is 12 feet. So when we say that these little capsules, data centers, whatever you want to call them, are underwater, we mean they're barely underwater.
Versus miles offshore where they can be seriously deep and the amount of water is just like orders of magnitude more.
Yes, and when you talk about open water, once you're talking about, several miles offshore, the further you get offshore, essentially, the less there is going on at the surface. The actual biological activity moves deeper the further out into open water you go. When you're talking about, way in coastal waters, only 12 feet deep, very small localized temperature changes can radically change how well suited the habitat is to algae. You can wind up with toxic algae blooms, which is where, algae just springs up seemingly out of nowhere overnight because you change a temperature coefficient or the salinity or the acidity of the water just a tiny little bit. And now instead of, a little bit of algae being able to eke out an existence in there, all of a sudden it's like algae heaven and it just explodes in density very rapidly. And that then can either draw in invasive species that are bad for the ecosystem, or they can choke out and kill fish that aren't adapted to deal with, that much algae in the water. There's all kinds of impacts you can have. So I love the idea of the underwater data center. I do not love the idea of an underwater data center that you can literally swim out to in your shorty shorts and your fins.
Yeah, and I think that's a big difference here between the ones we talked about that are hundreds of miles offshore and the ones that we're talking about, they're just going to put it in the bay. And the toxic algae blooms is a good point because around where I live in the Great Lakes, we've had problems with this where like beaches have had to be closed because there's been a toxic algae bloom. And if you swim in the water, you will get sick. And obviously, that's going to have an impact on the wildlife in the area as well. But when you have these algae blooms, they can also like cover all the water, meaning that no light gets through for other plants that normally grow in the shallow water there. and it can completely disrupt the whole ecosystem.
And potentially oxygenation as well.
Yeah, exactly. They can completely disrupt the area. And so, yeah, a couple of early 20-somethings with a startup are like, yeah, we don't need no permits. We'll just go and break the ecosystem. But one of the founders specifically even disputed the concern about the change of the temperature of the water, citing Project Natick. And it's like, yeah, but Natick was 100 or I think it was 200 miles off in the North Sea of Scotland. That's also at a very different latitude where the water is a lot colder and you're not going to, again, like Jim was saying, go above a certain temperature gradient that makes a big difference for wildlife.
Now, to be fair, Microsoft actually did also drop an unpermitted underwater data center off the coast of California. Natick wasn't just the ones in Scotland, which they did correctly, and they got the permits for those. But before that, they did drop one into San Luis Obispo Bay, which is about 250 miles south. I don't know all the details, but I'm going to guess it wasn't just 12 feet deep. And I do know that regulators did become aware of it and decided not to fine Microsoft, even though they had done the deployment without permits, because when they found out about it several years later, there had been no measurable environmental damage. So they just decided to let it go with a warning.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/25A. That's onepassword.com/25A. The other day I was out walking and I saw a cute cat and I took a photo of that cat. And then I had what would normally be a shower thought for normal people, but it was a kind of outside walking thought. And that thought was, how long is that photo going to exist? Because it's on my phone right now. While I'm asleep, it'll get backed up to my NAS, and then that'll get replicated to some various drives in the NAS and another one on my network, and then off to my parents' house. It'll also go up to Google Photos. And it just made me think, like, how long is that photo going to exist somewhere? Like, at some point in the future, the last copy of it will be deleted. And when is that likely to be? And I couldn't really put my finger on when that's likely.
I think to make this interesting, we probably just have to kind of hand wave and assume that you're personally curating it until you die. So as long as you're around, it'll be around.
Yeah.
So what we're really saying is, how long will your photos be around after you die?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not there to keep track of them anymore. And I think the answer is the vast majority of them will be gone pretty quickly. Unless you have a family member who treasures it simply because it was yours and they want to preserve it and they want to become the curator. Otherwise, it's not going to live for long.
Are you sure about that?
I'm pretty sure about that, yeah.
I remember taking care of my grandfather's Facebook account when he passed. And, we moved it into like a frozen memorial thing so it would stop asking people to wish him a happy birthday and things like that. But all the photos that are posted there are still there for our family to see. And it's been like 10 years at least.
Yes, but you acted as a curator and you actually told Facebook, preserve the account. And for now, Facebook is preserving the account. Do you think that Facebook will still be preserving accounts for generations? I mean, it's been like 10 years. That's nothing in terms of human lifespan.
Sure, but it's not, nobody's logged into this Facebook account for 2 years, so we're just deleting it either, right?
No, but again, you had to actually reach out.
Well, no, I reached out to make Facebook stop tormenting the rest of the family with messages from a dead person.
Sure, but if it had been somebody else and not you and somebody who didn't want to take care of it, then, Facebook might have just deleted it. If not presented with a specific request, that might have been the resolution. And at some point, I mean, Facebook is not going to, at some point in the future, be managing 98 billion people's photos, only 9 billion of whom are actually alive at the moment. It's not going to happen. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no perpetual motion.
Well, I think in particular that Facebook hasn't decided what their policy for that is yet.
Right.
And so it's very hard to predict what it will be, because the same thing goes for Google.
It's not hard to predict, is it? They're just not going to do it.
Well, you can't predict whether they're going to delete an account after 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or what.
Yeah. You can't predict when. You can predict the what.
Right.
Yeah, you can predict it's going to freaking happen, and it's not going to take that long. So anyway, ultimately, it comes down to a question of curation. Modern technology can make it easier to curate larger numbers of things and to do so with a higher level of quality, but it still requires actual human effort. Without human effort, everything gets dragged down into the entropy bin. And digital data is definitely not exempt for that. If anything, digital data is easier to lose and more of an effort really has to be made to preserve it. Now, you can preserve it with 100% perfect quality forever if you know what you're doing, and it's not that difficult. But it does still require effort. You have to be watching it. You have to be correcting failures as they occur. Somebody has to keep an eye on it.
I was thinking about the Google Photos aspect of it, right? Now, when it gets uploaded to Google, I'm assuming that it must get replicated to several disks minimum, right? It just has to. Otherwise, they're not doing their job right. And eventually my account will get shut down, after I'm dead. They'll just delete my account. They're already doing that for inactive accounts now. But the question then becomes am I sure that they're going to delete every backup of that? Are their systems competent enough to delete absolutely every single copy of it? Or might it sit on a server somewhere that they somehow have forgotten about?
I think the answer is a mixture of both. There are always going to be unlikely channels by which something can get preserved far longer than you would expect it to. People talk a lot about how, way back thousands of years ago, they used stone tablets, and look, because they use stone tablets, we have everything. This paper stuff is just gone next to no time, not realizing that that's not true. Very, very few of those fired clay tablets actually did survive over the millennia. Not much better than, books surviving over the millennia made out of paper. Basically, you have to wind up with the exact right conditions maintained for an incredibly long period of time in order for that physical object to not degrade past the point where you can get the data back off of it. And that's very unlikely whether you're talking about clay tablets or whether you're talking about paper or whether you're talking about hard drives or tape or, SSDs or you name it. The least likely for very long-term storage are SSDs because the charge levels absolutely dissipate in those cells when they're not refreshed, and it does not take that long.
Hang on, you said the least likely? What about optical media?
I mean, even optical media I would trust to be around for longer than an SSD that's not plugged in.
Really?
Yeah, again, the way an SSD works is it's by capacitance. You have a charged state that represents anything over a zero in each cell of the SSD, and that charge degrades over time. It's just like a battery eventually going flat. You don't expect a battery to still have full charge when you chuck it in a drawer and pull it out 20 years later. It doesn't matter that you never put it in a toy. Bro, that's been in a drawer for 20 years. It's no good. For SSDs, you will frequently see massive degradation after as little as 6 months unpowered.
But yeah, to Joe's point, you could definitely see cases where Google made the file not accessible to anybody anymore, but didn't necessarily destroy all the copies of it just because of the way snapshots and so on work. Or Facebook, if I'm not mistaken, for a bunch of the photo stuff, they're burning them to Blu-ray discs as like a read-only media. And so they have these, instead of tape libraries, giant libraries of Blu-rays, and they kind of write ones, read probably never on a lot of the times. But that means that even when they delete your account, they're not necessarily getting rid of the photos because it might be on read-only media. It's not available to you anymore, but it doesn't actually necessarily mean it's destroyed, but maybe it's effectively or morally the same thing. But yeah, it gets really interesting to think about how long it'll take for that last copy to go away and whether that last copy going away will be an active decision, even if it's by a program or something, to erase that file, or if it will just be when that last media eventually fails and they didn't bother to replicate it anymore.
It's a lottery ticket situation, essentially. It's what we're talking about is, regardless of which medium and which mechanism we're talking about for preserving something that is not being actively curated, it's a lottery ticket. And yeah, there is a winner to Well, there's supposed to be a winner in every lottery, but, it's one person out of, typically hundreds of thousands or millions of people. So statistically, still nothing's really living. I think the next interesting question that Joe's bringing up here, and Alan has kind of moved on to as well, is sort of a philosophical shift between now we're not talking about, can I get the file anymore? We're talking about, is the file potentially present in the archaeological record?
Yeah.
We're talking about the time when nobody knows who Joe Ressington is or was, but some very specialized people are digging through completely random people's old trash that they found somewhere hoping to find data. And will one of them happen upon one of your photos and be interested enough in it to do something with it, however far in the future that is?
Yeah, even a hard drive that's had a hole drilled in it, let's say, the bytes are still there somewhere on the platter.
Well, the parts of the platter that didn't get atomized.
Yeah. But so if I was lucky and this cat photo was on a bit of the platter that didn't get drilled through, if you had sufficient technology, you could read those bytes off it and reconstruct that photo in theory.
But realistically, nobody will, because if they can find your partial hard drive platter with holes drilled in it, they can find much better preserved ones. And it's already going to be work enough going through those. They're not going to have time to deal with your bullshit.
This is the philosophical question now. Does that photo exist if you could, in theory, retrieve it, even if no one does?
Yeah, sure. It is the tree that fell with no one to hear. And yes, it did still make a sound. The question is just whether you find that relevant or not. And, then the follow-up is it's still going to go away. Okay, that your crazy drilled platter fragment that technically still had sufficient magnetic encoding and not enough noise that somebody could retrieve your photo still existed at that point in time. But it's not going to be long beyond that, even in terms of human species timescale, let alone geological timescale, before there's nothing left there, man.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. Are you prepared for whatever shitstorm may hit your desk during the workday? Automox has your back. Check out the brand new Autonomous IT podcast. Listen in as various IT experts discuss the latest Patch Tuesday releases, mitigation tips, and custom automations to help with CVE remediations. Make new work friends. Listen now to the Autonomous IT podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you tune into your podcasts. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Bosjan writes, how do you store your SSH private keys? How many do you have? One for each client? Do you separate them, one for home lab, one for private computers, one for my company's computers, and one for clients? How often do you change them?
Nice try, FBI.
So how do I store them? Generally, that's just in my home directory, but encrypted rather than unencrypted, because most of the time I'm not doing automation with my SSH key. That would be a role-based SSH key that's used for things like replication. That'll be different. How many do I have? I think 6. Generally, that's one for each kind of identity or hat that I have. So there's the I'm Alan key, there's the Alan at FreeBSD key, there's one for my company and one for the other work I do, and things like that. How often do I change them? A few of them not as often as I probably should have. I've refreshed all of them relatively recently when I got a new laptop, but not generally as frequently as I should. It's probably something you might want to do once a year at least. But lately, it's usually for me been when I replace the machine that I do most of my work from. And that is not as frequent as it probably should be. And then I have one really high security machine that has a YubiKey, but that's more a requirement from the customer than something I would have opted for.
I tend to think of my SSH keys as kind of bound to individual machines more than anything else. I don't have any qualms about using the same pub key derived from the same private key on different machines at different customers. That's not really an issue for my model. But one thing that I do differently from a lot of people that I know of in the industry who are using SSH keys a lot is I don't make multiple copies of the private key. That private key only exists on that machine. I don't copy it to my other machines. If I need access from more than one machine, I'll generate a different private key on the second machine, and I will add its pub key as well to anywhere that I need to get into with that machine.
Right, so you have multiple pub keys on one machine then?
Exactly. I might have 8 different pub keys that are all mine on the same host. In theory, in practice, it's never going to be 8. It's more like maybe 2 or 3. But when I build a new machine, I will usually generate a new key with that machine, even if it's replacing an older one, and then I'll just deprecate out that key, amongst all the rest of the stuff. But that's pretty much just how it works. I don't change them because I don't lose control over my machines. All of my keys have passphrases associated with them, so even just grabbing the key isn't really going to do an attacker any good, and they only ever exist in one location, in a machine that's always under my control. Nobody else is using them. So no, I don't really have like a strict, it's been this long, this private key must be changed policy.
So do you exclude the SSH directory from your replication then?
No, I don't exclude it. So, yes, it is present on my backups, which are also machines that I control.
And it's encrypted with the passphrase.
Yeah, and it would be way less likely for somebody to manage to get to my backup server than to somehow compromise a machine that I, a fallible human meatbag, am personally using. That's going to be a lot less secure than the machine that sits off over in the corner without even so much as a GUI installed, and nobody ever touches it unless it's me coming to stand in front of it and type on the keyboard and look at the text on a monitor.
One other thing we do at my company is we have a jump host. It's not really that much about SSH keys, but some of our clients, would prefer it if everybody that works for us that connects to their machine comes from one place. So people inside the company use VPN to reach our jump server and then connect from there to the customer machine so that they're always coming from a specific address in addition to the expected SSH keys.
We have talked about this before. It's kind of different in that case, but I always feel a bit dirty and wrong if I'm SSH'd into one machine and then I'm SSHing into another machine.
We're not doing that. You're basically doing SSH-J, jump host, space, real host, and it does it all in one motion so that you don't have to have the private key for the final machine on the middle machine.
Right.
It all happens from the first machine.
So it's essentially just an SSH proxy.
Yeah. And it's a built-in feature of SSH that they added just after we started doing BSD now. So I think 2013. Before that, you had to make a SSH config file with a bunch of proxy command things set up in it to make it trigger the SSH for you. Whereas eventually, you can just use capital J, username at host, and then username at other host, and it will jump from the first to the second for you.
But yes, back to your point, Joe. Yeah, it's that you were describing very poor SSH hygiene when you just, rather than SSHing into the machine that you need and then exiting and then SSHing into another one from your own machine, or SSHing into the 2 different machines in 2 different console windows from your home machine, when you're just going from whatever machine you happen to be on to another one. I was guilty of that when I was younger. In a way, I actually found it kind of like perversely exciting. Like, you feel like Hacker Man, like, I'm 20 machines deep. It just works. It's awesome.
Yep. That was literally the premise of the video game called Uplink, which is a hacking simulator video game that I bought mail order from the UK when I was a teenager.
But should I feel bad for doing that with machines that are only on my LAN?
Yes, because it's building a bad habit. That's the only real reason, but it's building a bad habit. So yeah, feel bad about it.
Well, in particular, if the only way to get to machine C is by SSH from A to B and then B to C, you've kind of architected that wrong. And while it should be not possible to get from A to C directly, you don't want to have to manually run commands on B to do it. Because you basically don't want anybody who manages to log in as you on B to then be able to get to C without having to do anything else or have anything else. Whereas like if you just have your private key set up on B so anybody who logs in as Joe on B can connect to C without any extra steps, then you've definitely done it wrong.
This is why your SSH keys should always, always, always have passphrases associated with them.
Yeah, the only ones I have that don't are the ones I use for ZFS replication, but that runs as a completely separate user specific to that task and has no privileges and use ZFS allow to let it do the things it needs to do and only those things. It doesn't have sudo, it doesn't have access to anything else. It's just you can SSH over here and run this one command and that's it.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.